Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 368th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, the Special Projects Editor here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation with now here, Alice Hope, Bastienne Schmidt, Toni Ross, and Rail contributor David Rhodes. We are thrilled to also have our very own Special Projects Associate, Malvika Jolly, here to close today's program with poems by Diane di Prima. A few quick notes before we get started. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions. Closed captions are available by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of the screen. And we've started all of our events with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. The heart of both of these acknowledgements is a commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and solidarity for all who struggle for freedom, and recognition that when it comes to liberation, our histories never unfold in isolation, as spoken by the great Angela Davis. In that spirit, I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we will post in just a moment. But now to introduce today's guests and host. Artist Alice Hope holds an M.F.A. from Yale University and incorporates binary code, magnetism, reflectivity, and repetition in her compositions, and continues her focus on the cantab as her work's subject and material. Hope's recent and upcoming commissions include installations at the Queen's Museum and the new United States Embassy in Maputo, Mozambique. Multimedia artist Bastienne Schmidt works with photography, painting, and large-scale drawings. She was born in Germany, raised in Greece and Italy, and has lived in New York and Bridgehampton for the past 25 years. Schmidt grew up in Greece as the daughter of an archaeologist, which influenced her desire to organize, map, and understand various systems through her artwork. Conceptual artist Toni Ross uses time-honored material and site-responsive installation to explore themes of political and social distress. Her practice embraces fiber, installation, sculpture, and works on paper. Recent works have been exhibited at the Leiber Collection in Springs, New York, the Longhouse Reserve in East Hampton, and at the Parrish Art Museum. And last but certainly not least, we have New York-based artist and writer David Rhodes, who is a regular contributor to the Brooklyn Rail and has published reviews in Artforum, Art Critical, among other publications. He has paintings in the permanent collection of the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the Huntington Museum, Los Angeles. So without further ado, David, handing you the mic.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Welcome, everybody. And welcome, Alice, Bastienne, and Toni. We're here to have a conversation about the artist's current exhibition at Rico Moresca in Chelsea. The genesis of this exhibition occurred in 2019 when the artists met to discuss an exhibition concept that would highlight the influence of archaeology on their individual practices. And as a prompt, they decided to each select an object from the Metropolitan Museum's holdings of archaeological objects. And to their great surprise, they all chose the same object. This object is a navigational chart, Rebellion, and we'll see an image. Here we have an image of the chart. It's made of midribs of coconut palm. It's a lattice tied together by the people of the Marshall Islands. It's from the 19th or early 20th century, and it describes wave patterns, and ocean swells, and the location of islands. It's also used, as well as the navigational aid, it's used in order to pass knowledge from one generation to another. So as well as a mnemonic device to record the positions and activities in the ocean, it's a record to pass on generationally. The title of the exhibition, which is a wordplay, it can be nowhere or no here. It's taken from a book called Coral and Concrete from 2018 by Greg Dvorak. It's a book about the Kwajalein Islands, the largest inhabited atoll in the world. The atoll is between Japan, America, and the Marshall Islands. So the artists intend to respond, they intended to respond independently to both this object and their interests in archaeology, and so develop the exhibition that we're going to see images of, and perhaps you'll visit. Bastienne, you said that the piece became a centering piece for all the artists. Could you say something about how you all responded when you discovered that you'd selected the same object as a prompt for your discussions, and why perhaps you came to conceive of an exhibition together? I mean, is this something you've done before, or something you've planned for some time?
Well, the idea that we chose an object together and that it happened to be serendipitously the same object was kind of a miracle in itself. But once we found this object that we clearly loved and were mesmerized by it, it was kind of like a guiding line, not just in its physical essence, but also the metaphorical meaning of it. The pandemic happened right after we decided to do this exhibition together. So in a strange way, it became also our own wayfinding path and practice during this difficult time. The reason why we all were drawn to it, there's a physicality to it. It's made with humble materials. So it's kind of has the art of power kind of spirit. It should not have survived because it's so humble and simple. It did survive, but it's also a memory device. So all of these things together just kind of brought us onto this path. And we all are artists that work with a distinct concept of materiality that's very strong in all of our practices. So we were really excited about doing this together in that way.
Mm-hmm. And did the aesthetic qualities of the object have an impact on the work you went on to make for the exhibition? I'm presuming that once you'd established this object as being central to the organization of the exhibition, all three of you then went away and responded to it and produced new work, or did you also select work that corresponded to the interests that the navigational chart focused you on?
In my particular case, I had been working with the concept of grids for quite a long time, for the last 5-6 years. So it was this kind of amazing overlap of a natural grid, but also the Webering grid. And it's something that I cannot let go, because it's also this idea of how do we live in a system? How do we break the system open? Is there flexibility or rigidity? And this kind of dialogue is fit perfectly into it. That's my particular case.
Mm-hmm. And Toni, could you say something about your specific interest in the object and how you came to, maybe how you came to settle on this particular object too?
For me, it was in the beginning just a purely aesthetic response, and I was actually introduced to the piece by Bastienne, and I don't remember, 10, 12 years ago or something. And I had been in the oceanic wing many times, but it was sort of in this kind of hidden spot. And I would always visit the Cycladic room every time I always visit the Cycladic works when I go to the Met. And then that became my second destination repeatedly. So there's something about the elegance of the form that makes it feel so contemporary, yet it has this also like this mystical quality. And some of the work that I included in the show is work that had been informed by the chart, and then others I made somewhat in response to the chart, knowing that this was going to be the centerpiece of the exhibition. But one of the really great things in coming together like this was that though it was pre-pandemic, when we actually began to explore what this show might mean, the pandemic had hit. We were in quarantine, and the three of us as a collective group, I think, found a lot of stability and reassurance in being able to communicate with each other around this object.
Sure. Did you make studio visits, or did you do everything virtually?
So that's pretty interesting. We had conversations about the chart and learning more about the chart, and Alice was extraordinary in her outreach to a whole variety of curators and directors at a variety of museums. The Peabody reached out to the British Museum. Maya Nuku at the Met was extraordinarily helpful. But we had a very clear sense that we did not want to know what each other was actually working on. Because I think there was an assumption that because we had unbelievably selected the same object out of tens of thousands of objects at the Met, that the show would naturally come together. And we had also a lot of faith in Frank Maresca in terms of the installation, because his goal was to create an installation that was a show rather than a three-person show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting. So I'd like to ask Alice. You mentioned something about proprioception as related to the pandemic and the restriction in movement that we all experienced. And I was wondering how this observation impacted on your contribution to the exhibition, and whether it this interest in movement was a strong core element of how you think about your own work before the combined experience of pandemic, lockdown and restrictions, and the opportunity to think about this particular exhibition. So I was wondering if you could say something about those aspects.
The chart has a very mysterious element to it that I felt was inaccessible to me as a Westerner. And essentially it's trying to teach, or it does teach, a sixth sense in terms of understanding the wave patterns from one allele to the next. So and in our marriage to the GPS, I feel like we get further and further away from our sixth sense. But with the pandemic and the establishment of the 6-foot rule, we've had to reactivate a more 360 understanding of where we are in space. So while I felt in awe of this inaccessible understanding of wayfinding, I felt in myself a demand of like maintaining a distance that previously I was not aware of in terms of where my back is, where my front is. And so how that led me to the pieces in the show was making works that you can actually enter, but consequently you're aware of your body in relationship to the work itself.
So do you think that that single occupancy of a particular artwork is very much analogous to the experience of an enforced solitary dimension imposed by the pandemic? Was that in your mind, reproduced poetically?
It's deliberate that both pieces are single occupancies. And the box spring is even less than a twin. I think it has even a more narrow dimension than a standard twin, which in the box spring is what shapes the first piece that you can enter and walk through. And then the net, in constructing it and in standing inside it, it is, I liken it to a phone booth, and how uncomfortable it would be to get in the phone booth with two people. So it's just spaces that are very specific for single occupancy.
Right. How did you all place your works together in relation to each other in a kind of dialogue within the gallery space? Was this a very long process? Or, I mean, in order, it makes, it's not, as you described, it's not an exhibition of three artists who are deliberately separated from each other. The placement of the objects determines a kind of weaving in and out of experience, moving around, being with one object and another. The sight lines present different experiences.
We have to give complete credit to Frank for the installation itself. It came a little bit out of a conversation about front and back, I had an interest in my work being able to be seen front and back, and as did Alice. And also because the show has partly at its core the concept of navigation, whether that's waters or times or whatever it is, the installation itself actually forces you to navigate the space. And it was interesting to me when people have come to the gallery that there is sometimes a blurring of lines about whose work is which has been a really different kind of experience in a gallery, wouldn't you say?
Yes. Yeah.
I want to add something to this idea of how we understand space in its complexity. I think I'm more of a wall hugger than Toni and Alice, because they occupy space in a more three-dimensional way. But actually what is also, we're being held together by this idea you can touch something, you can feel something. And I think especially this dimension that there are different ways of touching something becomes extremely important in the time of the pandemic, because we are left with another sense of how do we engage with space, because space becomes either smaller or larger when we are outdoors, but there are less opportunities to kind of touch. So I think that was also an important thing that Frank really understood in a very kind of deep felt manner, to kind of create these different viewing points and angles that you can go from one idea, concept of a touch to another.
Yes, yeah. There's a very strong sense that it isn't a pure question of visual engagement with the work. The tactility really encourages a haptic experience. It's although there are wall-hugging works, they're not. They have a sense of engagement, a bodily engagement, rather than a distance, a nominal experience of looking at something. The fact that there are so many what appear to be found materials with a history, materials from the urban environment, it encourages an association and identification that moves through a directed aesthetic experience and everyday experience. So maybe in the same way as the navigational chart, which uses material from a coconut palm, you're actually bringing in material and recontextualizing for a completely other purpose. Do you think, but actually I meant to ask, the question of an anthropological or philosophical or aesthetic reading of the work that you've all put together. Was there a deliberation about blurring those boundaries, rather than presenting our objects to be contextualized within a fine art context? Did you want to broaden that issue?
Well, for me personally, I feel like the lines are always blurred. It's not just about art. Art is not a separate entity. There's always this influx of, it's an idea, it's a context, it's archaeology, it's sociology, it's anthropology. So it's when we think we are inspired by the world around us, and we are inspired by other people's histories and our own histories, and how we decide to kind of make it enter our work. Maybe that's the difference. I always say, in terms of my own work, I see it's just a manifestation of a thought, really, something that engages my thought process over a long period of time. And the work comes out and it goes on and on, because it's still the question and the answer, and to see how far I can push it as a process.
Right.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Bastienne that the lines are always blurred for me, and that there is a kind of collective memory that I believe in that exists over time, and that, you know, the idea that nothing's new, it's all coming from somewhere else. And so I don't see a lot of distinctions there. My work often deals with the passage of time, as do most of the pieces in this show. And I often see my work reflected in antiquities I never knew about, and vice versa.
I'll just add that each cantab that's in the show, I feel, is an artifact in that it's evidence of a moment in time of somebody opening up a can. And so it's a residue. It has a lot of history. So maybe more current, but I do feel like it has some social anthropology embedded in it.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be a connection with arte povera and artists who one could say are resourceful in their use of material. It seems through the exhibition, this is something you all share, that there's found materials with histories that have just in and of themselves a referent outside of their use as to construct an art object. So that seems thematically very strong. Would you say that's an aspect of your interest in anthropology or archaeology? Do you think it's too literal to talk about materials in that way? Or is it coincidence?
I mean, there's no question for me that is really interesting. And often it's the patina of time that really gets me excited. The way that something has aged over time sometimes can be even more interesting to me than the original object itself, or then looking at what was that original thing and how has it morphed over time. But there's something incredibly elegant and beautiful to me about what nature does to a surface, whether it's working with clay and glazes or twine or iron. I'm deeply drawn to these materials that react to the environment. And I sort of feel like it's almost impossible to create those kinds of subtleties were you to do it in a more purposeful way, although often I guide the patina to happen. Ultimately, it's like this collaborative project.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I feel also growing up as the daughter of an archaeologist in Greece, it's something that's imbued in my artistic nature. I mean, seeing my father working on long tables in the museum in Samos, on an island close to Turkey, and just laying out these shards of terracotta. And it was twofold. It was to see the artifact really survive for thousands of years, but then also creating a typology of it and trying to create a new system to understand what has happened in the past. So that's, I think, I also like to be in between system, because it's never just one system. We're trying to envision, to imagine how past lives were lived and what they meant. But then it's just an attempt of reconstruction. And I think Arte Povera does it in its own ingenious ways, because they work with things that are left behind and they reconstruct a new materiality without being really very fancy about it. But it has an incredible haunting poetry to it.
I was thinking about the reuse of materials, the recycling, and Walter Benjamin's idea of history and homogeneous time, the time of capitalism, the interchangeability of hours or minutes or days without time representing a particular event. And something he talked about was taking a historical event or evidence of a historical event and representing it. And this was a way of bursting through a kind of, homogeneous sleepwalking. So in looking at the objects you've all made, there is that sense of here's something that had a history that's taken for granted. It's kind of unconscious, and here it is re-enabled in a different form, and this emancipates or breaks through that unconscious, undifferentiated time. I mean, you could apply the same thing, similar thing to space, perhaps. So in moving things around, you expose their potential. They're no longer simply, their exchange values are not simply determined for you. You've taken these materials and reclaimed them. I mean, that seems a sociological, political reading of some of the work, without it being, it's obviously not cumbersome in the work that you make. I mean, none of your work seems cumbersome in that way. There's a strong visual, tactile poetry to it. So these are facts inherent in the process that you all individually elect to pursue.
I think also, especially when you refer to Walter Benjamin, and who also put photography into this context of it was like easily reproduced object. I've been reflecting for quite a few years also in the time of social media, and it's very easy to produce a flat image, a photographic image. But what does it mean in the end? How long do we hold on to it? Does it really elevate our spirits, or does it engage, or does it help? Does it hurt? So I think for me personally, it was also the desire to go back to artifacts and object making, and which include really this aspect of a tactility and an emotional kind of belonging to something that's stronger than our individual selves.
Right. Maybe we could look at some of the individual works, Nick, and start with Alice, and take a look at the images we have. Alice, what is that support for the cascade of tabs that you have there? It looks like bed springs. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It is also an artifact. I found it, and it was corroded and had a previous history. I love it just as a formal object, and like the cantab, it's negative space sort of equals its positive space, and the built-in repetition. And I can play with it as material, but also as a subject, in the sense that it's a substrate, but it also has many different references. And there were people, or a person that did sleep on it.
Right.
And I've made other pieces with box spring, but this is the most single occupancy work with a box spring.
And I think I'm right in saying you trained as a painter. Is that right?
Yes, and
So
yeah, I still feel I see the connection from my paintings to what I do now, and that when I painted, I would just have a collection of marks that would build up, and there would be an accumulation, and I like with the cantab, I would restrict my color, and I would just repeat the same over and over in order to get a population or a colony. And ideally it would waterfall and become something. But since then, I've just leaned on the more physical.
Mm-hmm. I think you said that you became more like a farmer than a painter.
Yeah, I'm definitely. I set up the conditions, and then the work starts making itself. And it's just my responsibility to continue feeding it. And it's crazy how much the work eats. I'm always surprised. It's insatiable, and it's never enough.
Right. A few artists came to mind looking at the exhibition, and not only to your work, Alice, but also to Bastienne and Toni's work. I thought about Felix Gonzalez Torres and Eva Hesse and Sheila Hicks, even Annie Albers, and also El Anatsui, a Ghanaian artist. Such disparate, very disparate artists, but somehow their work came to mind a little. And I wonder who if there are artists that are kind of key to the way that you also identify with. I mean, I think there's clearly a shared identification. There's a strong interest in each other's work here. But I wondered if you discuss if there are other artists in particular that you're very interested in discussing with each other.
Is that a question for Alice?
Well, yeah, yes.
I feel like we under-talk about artists, in the sense, but we all know, and we all look at art. We look at art together, but we don't. And I am very aware of the artists that Toni and Bastienne like, but it's interesting. We don't sit around and maybe Bastienne and Toni do, but we don't. It's the artists that I love. It's almost it's private. It's odd. It's just it's a private relationship. It's a bedroom relationship.
I think you've mentioned Yayoi Kusama before. I can definitely see a relationship to the environmental quality and the obsessive repetition, the poetic involving multiplicity of a single unit. That must be that's something you share with Kusama, obviously.
There's restraint that cuts in. And it's sort of in balance to the fecundity.
Interesting. And Bastienne, can I ask you about I'm very curious about the relationship in your work to photography, because I know you've produced books of journeys or travel photography, and this must have a strong connection with your experience. You're growing up with parents who drove across Europe, and you saw very different landscapes and cultures. And I just wonder, was there a moment, do you combine both activities, photography and the work we see in the exhibition, or have you left photography now?
It's a very interesting question. I mean, I started the practice equally as a photographer and as a painter. Then I moved to New York. I had to make a living very fast, like every struggling artist. And I fell more into photography. But I fell more into a type of photography where really allowed me to observe kind of traditions and customs of people. So my first book was about death rituals in Latin America. So for me, photography was always a tool of engaging really in other ways of being. And then when I moved out to the Hamptons and had 2 children, my practice also changed radically. And also my own relationship to photography, because photography had changed. There was really not a good way to make a living through photography. And I became more interested in just creating my own art practice. And in a way, I think all of my past experiences led me to this moment. So I could not have gotten there otherwise. So what really informed my way of growing up in Greece, living in Italy for a long time, being exposed to the works of Yannis Kounelis and Buri, and seeing like basically a surface, a space as a conceptual way in a photograph. So I create also these mini performances as installations in the snow that I photograph, and the only thing that's left is the photograph. On the other hand, I create also physical objects that I photograph to document them. So for me, it's a process that can go back and forth. And it's a language that gives in different ways. It's like speaking different languages. I speak 6 languages, and people always ask you, what's your favorite language, or what's your favorite country? And I think you cannot choose in the end. There are certain ways of expressing yourself. It's a tool. So you use it wherever you see it fit. So I insert also natural materials a lot in my work, which also deals with this idea of space. I go in my garden, I see what falls down or what I can recycle. I'm an avid collector of useless objects. Might it be small bars of soap or lint or dust. And it's not always knowing what will come out of it, but I know I can use it at one time.
Right.
So this piece actually, Grid with Sticks, that's an exhibition that I had created before we decided on the show. But for me, it was already the engagement with this concept of grids, and I started sewing with a grid, which for me was the beauty that the sewn line is a soft line. So it's a soft form of geometry, and it allows you to kind of have like a poetry within the line, because a strictly geometric line is not so interesting to me. I say as an example, like the difference between Annie Albers and Joseph Albers. Joseph Albers, he worked a lot with geometry only, but it was a very strict, rigid geometric line. Whereas Annie Albers, because she worked also much more with weaving, it was like a softer line. And it's very interesting. I think today there is also the resurgence and the rediscovery of soft materials and kind of 2-dimensional objects that are really woven or have a texture in it. And I think the reason for that is that we really rediscover the softness in geometry itself.
Right, right. Do you think it's also perhaps a reaction against the way in which there's a tendency to equate what we see on the screen, as we're doing now, with an actual object? So there's a tendency to create objects that are unavailable in a way. So they're quite clearly approximated, whereas flat images, so in some cases, the amount of information available, say from the piece we're looking at, or from almost all painting, most of the information's not there because it's tactile and it's variable in light conditions, which are crucial to the way the painting or object is seen, and it's inadequate to have a single image represented that's been photographed or presented on the screen.
I want to say also in terms of particular sewn white grid series, the light also becomes part of the object itself. And so it's a changing component, because wherever you put it, and the light itself, like that goes into the house, changes according to the rhythm of the sun. And it's something very soothing to see that it's not a finished object, but it can change through the influx of light and shadow.
Right. Yeah.
So this is a wavering grid. And again, these are twigs that I found in exactly that shape. And for me, it was also this idea that I pay respect to what is out in nature and letting it loose while still finding an order or a structure. And it's also probably the piece that's most in response to the navigational chart, because what's so fascinating about the chart is the grid, but it's also the kind of soft movements, kind of imitating the wave patterns and the crests and the fall of the waves. And it creates a kind of openness.
Absolutely, yeah. This piece makes me also think of Toni's use of thread, and that if I could ask Toni about the use of twine and the idea that a material has a memory or an inherent gesture. And as we see in Bastienne's piece, the shape is, it's not determined by the piece. The piece presents the material in a new form, but the reason for the curves are from its inherent characteristic.
Right.
I think that only this is true of your use of twine, isn't it?
Yes, on many levels. One of the really interesting things about this hemp twine is it does have this extraordinary memory, and it also is kind of alive, like it will wrap itself around each other in ways that I did not fully anticipate. And I would often think when I had pieces out, you know, site responsive works out in the open, I would have thought that somebody had been there and kind of twisted these things together. But in fact, they do this on their own. But in this piece in particular, this was a piece that was very tightly wound with this twine as part of a larger installation. And the coloration is all the patina that happened over the course of a year and a half. And then what I decided to do was cut the bottom and release the tension. And interestingly, having wrapped so much twine around this iron structure, the twine became stronger than the structure itself and bent the iron. So completely unanticipated by me, where I thought maybe my ironworker had built them wrong. But in fact, it was the aggregate strength of the twine that was really outweighing the strength of the iron. And it's something that is very interesting to me and what I sort of explore in my work is sort of challenging notions of strength and fragility. And often twine, you know, I've used very fine twine and it appears to be very fragile, but in fact, I've then juxtaposed it with either boulders or fired clay, or in this case with the iron, to kind of challenge one's notions of fragility and strength. And to me, like in this, I just find really the patina and the way that the string has found its route across itself is really beautiful. And I spent a lot of time sort of studying knots and deciding which knots I was going to use for this larger piece. And I also have a tremendous fascination with remnants. And so from this work, I created a number of other pieces that are in the show. And I, like Alice, I just like collect, or maybe Bastienne was saying, I collect them and you just know you're going to use them sometime. It's just not clear how that's going to happen. And often they're remnants of work that I've previously done, you know, pieces I've cut off of something, and I just have stacks of them until I find the right use.
Mm-hmm. And the interest in the process of surface, is this connected to your work in ceramics?
Absolutely, no question. When I've often used surface treatments and glazes that are very responsive to the atmosphere, and like a Japanese Shino and some others that will behave differently depending on whether the day is humid or dry, or what the conditions are in the kiln. And so there's this tracking of time and experience that is really interesting to me, whether it's clay or the twine, or the iron. You know, the iron frame I left completely unsealed because it's a little less visible here, but I wanted the rust to occur. And then I was hoping the rust would then bleed onto the twine, and there are parts of it you can see better than others. And I have some other pieces where the rust has really created this incredible pattern on the hemp itself. So yeah, you know, the other interesting thing is that my work has for a long time been about capturing those effects of time. And then when we entered the pandemic and we were in quarantine, and for me, and I know for many others, we completely lost all sense of time, and it was a serious, still I find quite disorienting. My work became more about my own experience of time, which has a little more to do with the other piece, one of the other pieces I have in the show with the red weaving in it, and about what was happening to me or to us through time. So those are sort of different approaches to that same kind of interest.
Sure. Maybe, Nick, it's time to have some questions.
Sure. I wanted just to ask if there were maybe, or Toni, if you wanted to refer to some of those other images that we had mentioned in the pre-check.
Sure.
Did you perhaps want to, before we get into the Q&A, have a look at those?
Yeah, if you want to show the other details of some of the knot drawings, and maybe the twine on paper, the works on paper.
Sure, just one moment. Let me pull that back up, sorry.
Oh, and also the, yeah. So this is a series of work that I did that these are remnants of a larger installation that I did, the Longhouse Reserve, where I created these 10-foot, 12-foot cubes that surrounded trees on their property. And those are the images that you have, Nick. And so the large frame that you had just seen and all of these knots are from that original installation at Longhouse.
Did you say that some of these patterns represent COVID tracking charts? They have
Yes, so Yeah, oh, actually, this is not the right image. Huh. This is prior to this piece being finished. That's okay. This piece was, again, part of this larger installation. I removed the original twine, rewrapped it, and then was really looking a lot early on in the pandemic at these graphs of the hotspots where the virus was occurring in the United States. So this was sort of a New York, California, Florida kind of hotspots inspired piece where I was also sort of tracking the graph of the virus and then sort of throwing it off into space on the other side of the piece. Yeah. So this is sort of more of an example of my own experience of time rather than the effects of time on a material.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry about that, Toni. I
Okay.
want to pull up, I believe this is what we were.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So the large frames, the iron frames are actually how this installation was built. And when I deconstructed, this is very early in its existence. It hadn't really patinaed much yet, but over the course of a year, things began to change and discolor. And that to me is very beautiful. So when I deconstruct it, you can see each frame built up together, and you were able to go inside of this. And I kept each frame knowing that somewhere down the line, they seem like paintings in and of themselves to me. And so currently I'm working with those frames, and I have a few of them in the show. And this is an entrance into one of the pieces. I also, you talked earlier about, you know, containers and what has taken place inside of something. That's also really interesting to me. You know, what used to happen there, what does happen there.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Well, if now seems like a good time, we could take some questions from the audience, if that's okay with all of you. Great. I am going to pass the mic first to Lynn Crawford, our friend. I think sort of as a clarification on the original work that we were talking about. Lynn, I'm going to pass you the mic.
Thank you. This is great, you three. It's mesmerizing. I hope I can see the show. Initially, the grid that you showed, which I might have misunderstood this, but that was a navigational chart. For what? For an ocean, for a lake, for a river, for a body of water? Or
yeah,
land?
It's a Marshall Islands navigational chart
So
to
what
navigate.
Go ahead. Sorry.
To navigate the atolls in the Marshall Islands, which consist of thousands of small islands and atolls, and really it was meant to predict where those atolls would be by understanding the wave patterns in the water. And it was interestingly used as a mnemonic device so that the sailor would create this and then commit it to memory and then go out on the waters. They didn't take these with them.
Wow. That's fascinating. What struck me, and I might be completely wrong, but I guess given the time this happened, there would be mostly or exclusively men on the boats charting, navigating. And here you three women are making this brilliant work, and then you're talking about fluidity of time. And it's just this interesting intervention I just had in my head of this sort of multi-past, present, future, gender, imaginary space that you're all creating. I couldn't get that out of my head throughout this whole talk. So I was really I'm glad to know it was water. But I don't know if you were thinking of that, the three of you separately or together.
Definitely. I mean, I did a project for the Parish Art Museum, part of the Parish Roadshow in the Whaling Museum. And it was also the question how to engage with the artifacts of that museum. And one thing that came up that both men and women had to know how to sew to fix the sails and to kind of get everything going. So for me, it became also a metaphor. A lot of times men and women have to share the work because it's necessary. And these are actually the kind of territories which are particularly fascinating, where you need a collaboration.
Interesting. But the women wouldn't be on the boat. They would do the work.
Sometimes they were. In rare cases, actually, the captains would take their families. But in the history of whaling in the United States, it was a pretty grim business. So mostly it was like single man.
But you're right about the Marshall Islands navigation charts. It was for the men, and the women stayed on the islands.
Excellent.
Yeah, that was a really interesting observation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lynn. I think our next question is somewhat related to this, so I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Ty. Ty, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Hi, thank you for this really lovely talk. It's been so interesting to hear you all in conversation. And I was thinking about how it's really like, obviously, serendipitous that out of like all the works at the Met, you all chose the same work to respond to for this show. And I was wondering what other works at the Met you were thinking about that you almost chose, or what each of you were drawn to.
I mean, I think I can speak for both Toni and me. The cycladic section of the Metropolitan Museum is mind-blowing. It's again the idea of a humble object that is most likely part of a grave offering that survives thousands of years, but it has also kind of a spiritual quality, and it has its own essence. Although it's probably different than what we imagine it, because a cycladic object used to be painted. And the way we see them now, it's something very sparse and minimalist, and that's what I love about it too. But I think that's part of history too. Like we each make up our own histories, what we let in also in our understanding of what we like and love.
I'm also really drawn to the money coils from the San Luis Islands. There's one in particular that was very closely exhibited to the chart. So yeah, those are my two favorites.
Thank you.
Toni, I don't know if you had anything to add. I just want to make sure
No, I think Bastienne covered it. Like
okay.
Cycladic work has been really present for me since very, very early on. I will never forget the first piece I saw, which was at the Getty, actually, when it was before the new Getty or anything. And I could not get it out of my mind. And it really was a major influence on all of my earlier and still in my work, just in terms of its simplicity of form. And then, of course, like the sort of Middle East, the Turkish kind of area of the Met, which is upstairs, that has these incredible bas-reliefs that have sort of incised writing that literally go across and through the figures that are carved there. I find incredibly beautiful, because I also have a tremendous interest in the rhythm of writing, not always the words, the specific words themselves, but the way writing lays out.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Ty, for that question. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to our friend GE. GE, you should be able to turn on your mic.
Thank you. I'm so taken by these works this afternoon, all of them. And they seem to be so much more than just art. And I think they transcend maybe being art almost in a way that the navigational chart does. And I was wondering, the question is a general one, because of that, are these kind of like works of ceremonies of time as like rituals of showing cause in an infinite world? I mean, even more than art, working that scientifically and all the rest,
I like that concept a lot. I feel also art is sacred in a way. There is a sacredness to it that you assign to it. I mean, maybe not everybody sees it or perceives it, but the impetus where it's coming from, it's a real sacred place.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And the process, I think for all of us, but I can only speak for myself, is an extremely meditative and therefore somewhat spiritual process, especially with either with my weaving or with my ceramics that are all sort of small aggregate assemblies. There's this out-of-body experience that kind of happens while I'm in it. And it is definitely a kind of a tribute to moments in time and that experience of that time, whether it's a slowing down or capturing the moment. And I'm always surprised to then come out of it and look and see where I am.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And I just wanted to add too, I think we share a belief that art has the power to locate us. And there is a historical with the gestalt of sculpture and how that can make one aware of their place in time. But I think we aspire for the location to be more metaphorical as well.
I want to thank you for that, both that comment and that question.
It just meant so much to me because I was entering into this almost ritually, just taking these things in. So I appreciate it. Thank you all.
Thank you, GE, for that wonderful question and for your wonderful responses. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Sarah. Sarah, you should be able to turn on your mic now.
Great. So I was just wondering how this collective experience, which is the first for the three of you as a collective, has impacted your individual practices and how it will impact your practice moving forward, collectively and individually.
I mean, I can say personally what's really invigorating and inspiring to add all of our voices together. It creates like a different melody and it creates a different power. And of course, we all have been working for artists for decades, but it is something different. So the whole concept of our collective is also to generate new projects, to continue to dialogue with the navigational chart, because we think there's still something of value and depth in it, and to generate projects where we would invite also other artists or other community members into it, to see it also as not just as an art practice, but as a social practice.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect response. And for me, it also broadens my thinking, because having these kinds of conversations with Alison and Bastienne, we come up with ideas that individually we might not have developed on our own, but together it becomes quite exciting.
Yeah, there's just a belief in the synergy that 1 + 1 + 1 is greater than 3, that there's something in the alchemy of collaboration.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sarah. Next, I'm going to pass the mic over to Frank. Frank, you should be able to turn on your mic now. There you are. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome.
I think actually my question was just asked by Sarah and probably to a great extent answered by Toni. What I wanted to know was through this exhibition, given the fact that all three artists have known each other for a very long time, if they can point to something new that they've learned about each other as a result.
I think we navigate pretty well together, so that's the great news. And it only validates, yeah, we are community members, we're part of the same tribe, and we decided to go in a canoe together, and I will do it again and again. So that's for me the synthesis.
So, but is there any sort of one thing that you can point to and all of a sudden you say, gee, you know, well, I never knew that about Alice, or I never knew that about Toni. Has it given anyone new insight into each other as artists or as humans?
Yeah, we're all pretty obsessive compulsive.
Yeah, it sounds kind of crazy to say, but I feel like the experience just validated what we knew about each other, unless there's something you discovered about me. But it validated what I thought I knew, and it certainly solidified, not that it wasn't solidified before, a trust in the two of them and the three of us together, because we definitely navigated some difficult times between the three of having this take place during the pandemic. It was a scary time, and it was so extraordinary to know that we could lean on each other spiritually and artistically, and get that support when one of us might have been wavering.
Yeah, I might just be saying the same thing, probably. But I feel fundamentally it's just brought me home to how it all comes down to relationships, and I'm so grateful to have had this almost daily dialogue with Bastienne and Toni, and then also the relationships along the way. The chart was my holy grail in terms of the conversations that we reached out to, for example, Maya Nuku. So my takeaway is it's all about that.
I want to say something else. It's very rare also to have this total trust in a group of women also, because there's so many things that sometimes are stacked against us, because it's just not an easy world as an artist, no matter what anyway. But it kind of validates, it's about the seriousness of the dialogue in the end of the day. But if three people decide to do it together, it just makes it easier, the whole process. And you feel like you can do it again and again.
I would say though that I did, Alice is a fearless leader. And like she said earlier, she's very private, and she's very, you know, those conversations about other artists and artwork are like her bedroom talk. But I really discovered that she will just take things under control and contact the people that need to be contacted. And we had, because of COVID, we had these extraordinary conversations with people all around the world, whether they were in Japan or New York City or Boston or in the Marshall Islands. It was extraordinary. And Alice initiated a lot of those conversations, you know, virtually.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that question. Thank you for your responses, and thank you all for taking us on this canoe trip today. But for our final...
I wanted to say also, Nick and
Yes.
and everyone, that going into this project, I did not have a clue as to whether or not it was all going to work together. It just, certainly because of COVID, but with the goal being producing a show that was essentially a 3-person show that was really a one-person show, with works that were so dissimilar to one another, with all of the boxes basically that needed to be checked. I was incredibly nervous, and I don't remember being as nervous designing or curating an exhibition ever in a gazillion years. So when it finally all came together, and the 3 artists came in, and everyone really liked and enjoyed what was going on, it was clear to me that it was working. I was no longer nervous.
It's certainly a testament to trust then.
Blind trust.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Frank. And for our final question of the day, I'm going to pass the mic over to the Rail's own Phong H. Bui. So Phong, over to you.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Toni, Sebastian, and Alice.
Hi.
And
Phong.
also David for guiding the dialogue. Hi, very thoughtfully. And it brought a lot of ideas in my head at the moment. I have to be in and out to meet up with some phone call, but other than that, I think I listened to 7% of it. And I noticed that early on, David had mentioned some reference to Eva Hesse. And then also Bastienne mentioned about her father being an anthropologist, and Alex training at Yale and whatnot, and the whole dialogue somehow based upon the collective attempt, even though before COVID, it's actually helped you all to heal and mediate right through as we are listening to it and realizing, as I have the privilege in the show before, when it just opened, when I came to the gallery and spent some time with Frank, I realized that there are aspects of, I would say, natural history, paleontology, anatomy, linguistic, and ethnology, all of it together. There's a rhythm. There, I heard the word melody being mentioned. And I think, I can't help but think of dance, choreography, ethnology. I would even bring up Gestalt psychology. And particularly in reference to Maya Deren's great film of 1946, is called Ritual in Transfigure Time. And Maya Deren, as much as Eva Hesse, have a strong interest in anthropology and ethnology and everything in between, have to do with cultural relativism, which is a term that Professor Frank Boas, who was a teacher of Margaret Mead at Columbia University, coined, have to do with the idea that the person's beliefs and practice should be explored and be understood based on that person's own culture. So the fact that there is just this collective collaboration, anthropology and surrealism combined in a way, because as you remember, André Breton and a lot of surrealist artists were very interested in finding a way to liberate from the shackles of authoritarian rationality, by dislocating conventional reason, by inventing their own, let's say, automatic writing, all kind of text in chain operation. And of course, dreams sequence was a very huge access to their own way of thinking, of doing so. And I can't help but also thinking the idea of exquisite corpse, you know? So I wonder how much of surrealism, how much of, you know, healing as a process, even though you intuited itself, you know, that idea, you know, I love Lynn, our friend Lynn Crawford had the word quiddity. So I wonder how much of that, you know, were from the get-go in your mind, or was it already happening gradually as you three begin to do work? Because I know that you didn't want the other to look at the product or the object the other one made. So definitely there's a chain operation involved here. So in relation to surrealism, I like to see whether that's have entered your thinking, conceptual thinking from the get-go.
I mean, in my particular case, not really, but I'm not so in tune with just the surrealist movement as in terms of what I feel drawn to. But when you talked about Eva Hesse and the influences of ethnography and Gestalt psychology, that's absolutely. It's like that you take like the idea of a form and the repetition of a form that will change in an organic way. Absolutely. So I don't know how the others feel about it.
Alex?
I would say it's more coming from an intuitive place than an academic place in the studio. But over time, I believe we all hope for multiple and conflicting reference points. And that's what's how I feel like it becomes successful, is when the reference points contradict each other, and there's argument, there's agreement, there's conversation.
Okay, Toni?
I also had didn't have surrealism in mind at all. And I agree with Alice that, you know, I work in a very intuitive way. But I think, Fang, you mentioned, did you mention healing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so for me, the work was like crucially healing at a very, very difficult time. And there was something about working with textiles that was so grounding to me, and set up a situation where every day I was still in the process of creating this piece, and had this crazy notion that I knew where I was going in a way. In a larger sense, we had no idea where we were going. So the healing piece of it was really, really strong. And I was very aware of that pretty much all the time. One of the very cool things about doing something public like this and having this kind of feedback is then I'm thinking, oh, well, what is it about surrealism then that is a tangential to the work that's interesting to me?
Great. I mean, after all, healing have to require some form of dispense of preconception of what you know, your own knowledge previously of things that you have been so familiarized with. So I think art making is really about channeling other dimension. So I think in this instant, the healing process is really tied to that channeling that have to do with three of you coming together from the unconscious dreams and other form, rather than the the usual conventional rational sense, for sure. So thank you so much, you guys. I might need to go back to see the show again, and thank you.
Thank you.
Back
Thank
to
you so much.
Thank you.
No, so much gratitude. And also, I just wanted to say to David that the artists that you mentioned are all tremendous heroes of mine, and I'm deeply humbled to be mentioned in that, in relationship to them. And thank you.
Mine too, because the use for the tactile materials and all its different variations as well, it keeps on giving. It's a gift.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And yes, this is a good chance for me to say, we'll post it in the chat, but if you're able to go see the show, it is on view until September 11th here in New York at Rico Maresca. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today and for all of your questions. But here at The Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today we have a special reading lined up in anticipation of a tribute to the late and great poet Diane di Prima, which we will be doing next Wednesday. We'll post some details in the chat there. But I am very happy to welcome my colleague, Rail Special Projects Associate Malvika Jolly, here to read poems by Diane di Prima. Malvika, I'm handing the mic over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. And thank you, Toni, Bastienne, Alice, and David. This has been such a beautiful, generative talk. Alice, I loved what you said at the very open, that you set up the conditions and the work starts making itself, and it's just your responsibility to keep feeding its insatiable stomach. I love that so much. It made me think of sort of how best practices for art making, cultivating the yeast, cultivating the self. So as Nick mentioned, I'm going to read two poems from Diane di Prima's Revolutionary Letters, a tome that came out in that year, which, like so many others, specific and certain others, I feel that we're still living in the wake of and hold in our memory. So that's 1968 when it was released. Diane di Prima, to so many of us, feels uniquely hyper-local. She was born here in Brooklyn, an icon of friendship, solidarity, coalition building, community. And when she passed away just last year in October, it really felt like the poetry world experienced an aftershock, and we all were, every day someone was reading a revolutionary letter, using a revolutionary letter. They were like lunchbox poems. We were folding into each other's pockets. So as Nick mentioned, we're celebrating her life and legacy next Wednesday, August 25th, with a tribute. It'll be featuring some fantastic poets and readers: Amiel Al-Khalei, Robert Kelly, Sarah Larson, Erin Shurin, Cedar Saigo, David Levi-Strauss, and Ant Wallman. And they'll be in conversation with Neely Tchaikovsky. So I'll be reading Revolutionary Letter number 14 and Revolutionary Letter number 10. And I will say, like, in its own time, this is so unique that the text was called A Handbook of Countercultural Living, kind of a manual for street protest. And what I love about it is it's almost like grocery lists for the revolution. And it's so enormous, you can use it as a doorstop. You kind of wallop someone over the head with it if need be. So I'll show you, I'm gonna screen share the content and we'll get right into it. Just what an iconic, can everyone see all right? Okay, perfect. So Revolutionary Letter number 14. Are you prepared? Are you prepared to hide someone in your home indefinitely, say 2 to 6 weeks, you going out for food, etc., so he never hits the streets? To keep your friends away coolly so they ask no questions, to nurse him or her as necessary, to know first aid and healing, not to freak out at the sight of torn or half-cooked flesh, to pass him on the right time to the next station, to cross the Canadian border with a child so the three of you look like one family, no questions asked, or fewer, to stash letters, guns, bombs, forget about them till they are called for, to keep your mouth shut, not to trust, even your true love, that is. Lay no more knowledge on him than he needs to do his part of it, a kindness we all must extend to each other in this game. So that's number 14. And now we move back 4 poems, 4 pages to number 10. It's a Revolutionary Letter number 10. These are transitional years, and the dues will be heavy. Change is quick, but revolution will take a while. America has not even begun as yet. This continent is seed. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Malvika, and thank you to the spirit of Diane di Prima. Want to thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you so much, Alice, Toni, Bastienne, David. A special thanks to Frank and Alejandra at Rico Maresca for making today possible. And once again, I'll remind you all to visit the show in New York while it's on view. We are here every day at 1 p.m. As you know, we're doing a tribute to Diane di Prima next Wednesday, the 25th. But if you're able to, join us this coming Monday for a conversation on the artist Huguette Caland with Brigitte Caland, Claire Gilman, and the Rail's own Eleanor Hartney. You can all now turn on your mics to say hello or goodbye. And I'm wishing you all a relaxing weekend. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See the show.
Thank you
So much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Happy weekend.
Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bastian.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye.
Thank you.